Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're moving past the old idea of just, developing a few star leaders. We're diving into something that's really gaining traction in U.S. workplaces, building leadership capital.
That's right. It's a shift.
It really is. Think of it less about individual brilliance and more about creating an organization, a whole system where leadership can actually thrive everywhere. And some early research is showing that companies strong in this, they see way more innovation. That's a real edge, especially now.
Exactly. And, what our sources are telling us is that the way things are changing so fast in the U.S. business world today, well, relying only on those traditional leadership pipelines, it's just not cutting it anymore. The focus really needs to shift. It has to be about cultivating these leadership capabilities across the entire U.S. organization.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's break down what leadership capital actually is, figure out why it's suddenly so important for U.S. companies right now, and look at the practical ways organizations here are starting to build it. All right, let's get into it. Fundamentally, what are we talking about with leadership capital?
Okay, so at its heart, it's recognizing that leadership isn't just a title someone holds. It's not a position on an org chart. It's more of a collective strength. Herminia Ibarra put it really well. Leadership is not a position, it's a collective capacity. So leadership capital basically is how well a U.S. organization as a whole can adapt, can align people, influence across different teams, and actually get things done through others working together.
Collective capacity. That's a really powerful phrase. How is that different from just having, say, a bunch of really smart, experienced people in a U.S. company?
Yeah, good question. It's less about the individual superstars, though they matter, of course. It's more about the underlying systems and the culture within that U.S. organization, the things that let leadership actually emerge and spread. Think of it like city infrastructure.
Right.
You can have amazing drivers, sure, but if the roads are bad, the signals don't work, public transport is a mess.
No.
Well, the whole city grinds to a halt.
Okay, yeah.
So leadership capital in a U.S. company is similar. It includes things like the social norms, how people actually interact day to day. It's the distribution of skills, not just technical, but leadership skills. And it's the shared mindsets that allow everyone to step up, especially facing the kind of challenges we see constantly in the U.S. market now.
The infrastructure analogy really clarifies the shift in focus. Okay, so what are the actual building blocks then? What makes up this infrastructure in a U.S. context? Let's get concrete.
Absolutely. So one huge piece is relational trust. This is fundamental. Can diverse teams across a U.S. company have those tough, honest conversations, but still feel safe, psychologically safe? That trust is the bedrock. Then there's strategic sense-making. That's the ability, collectively, for the U.S. company to look at market changes, new tech, whatever's coming, and figure out together, okay, what does this mean for us? Where do we go?
Okay, so trust and this kind of shared understanding of the big picture.
Yeah.
What else is essential for leadership capital in U.S. firms?
Feedback loops are really vital. We're talking about the systems, both formal and informal, that you see in successful U.S. workplaces. They allow for quick reflection, learning from what happened, and then adjusting course fast.
Yeah.
Agility. We also see leadership at all levels. This is more cultural. In many high-performing U.S. companies, influence isn't just handed down by title. It's earned through contribution, through expertise. People listen because you know your stuff, not just because of your job description. And finally, institutionalized learning. This isn't just training programs. It's the practices, the routines, maybe even daily rituals in U.S. organizations that deliberately build and scale leadership behaviors. It's making leadership development part of the ongoing work life in the U.S.
Those are definitely powerful elements. But if they're so crucial, why haven't more U.S. companies been focusing on building this broader capacity all along? What held them back?
That's a really critical question. Traditional leadership development in the U.S., it often grew up in a more stable time, I think before 2019 maybe. But now, with the pace of tech change like AI, the shift to hybrid work, growing expectations around ESG, how companies impact society and the environment, plus all the global economic uncertainty, it's really exposed the limits of those older approaches here in the U.S.
Right. The ground has totally shifted under everyone's feet in the U.S. business world. So how exactly did that highlight the weaknesses of just focusing on individual leaders?
Well, you see three main limitations becoming really obvious in this new reality. First, over-individualization. When a U.S. company puts all its eggs in the basket of developing just a few star leaders, it creates a real fragility, doesn't it? What if those key people leave? What happens to your leadership then?
Yeah, big gap.
Second, static competency models. Those traditional lists of what makes a good leader, they can get outdated fast. The skills needed in, say, 2019, they might not be enough for the complexities of the 2025 U.S. workplace. These rigid frameworks just can't keep up with how U.S. businesses need to evolve.
That makes total sense. It's like using an old map for a new territory in the U.S. market.
Precisely. And the third big limitation is an over-reliance on training. Now, workshops and courses have their place, but often the learning doesn't stick. Why? Because it's disconnected from the daily grind back in their U.S. teams. People learn something in a training room, then go back to their day job, and it just fades. So the fundamental shift needed in the U.S. is moving away from this person-by-person development idea towards building a systemic capability, leadership across the whole organization.
Okay, got it. So we ditch the individual leader fixes and focus on building this more resilient, distributed leadership capacity across U.S. companies. Makes sense. But how? How do organizations actually build that? You mentioned a flywheel idea. Tell us about that in the U.S. context.
Right, the flywheel of leadership capital. It's a concept inspired by Dave Ulrich's work on organizational capabilities. It basically describes a continuous cycle, a self-reinforcing one, for building this capacity throughout a U.S. organization. The first stage is embed. This is all about weaving those desired leadership behaviors right into the daily routines, the processes, the way work gets done in the U.S. company. The key question you'd ask is, how is leadership actually lived day-to-day in our U.S. operations? Is collaboration encouraged? Is feedback normal? Do people feel empowered to take initiative?
So making leadership less theoretical and more about just what people actually do every day in the U.S. workplace. Okay. What's the next stage in the flywheel for U.S. companies?
Next up is scale. This is about using the existing social fabric, the networks within a U.S. company, to amplify those leadership behaviors. Think about things like peer coaching programs, team-based learning focused on real U.S. business problems, maybe robust mentoring systems that go beyond just formal assignments. The question here becomes, who else across our U.S. teams is reinforcing these behaviors? It's about creating a whole network of support.
That sounds much more woven into the fabric of a U.S. company than just, say, sending people off to training. More sustainable, maybe. What follows scaling?
After scaling comes signal. And this was critical. It means aligning all the formal systems in the U.S. organization, how you reward people, recognition programs, who gets promoted with those leadership behaviors you want to see. The core question for U.S. companies here is stark. What actually gets rewarded around here? If you talk about collaboration, but only reward individual wins, well, you've got a major disconnect. That kills your leadership capital efforts.
Right. Actions definitely speak louder than words, especially with rewards in the U.S. workplace. Those signals are powerful shapers. And the last stage?
The final stage is reinforce. This is where U.S. companies use data. You need to measure the density of this leadership capability across the organization. Find out where it's strong, where it's weak. The key question is, how do we actually know if this is working across our U.S. operations? You might use surveys on trust within U.S. teams, maybe analyze decision-making speed, or track if specific leadership behaviors are actually being used. And that data then feeds right back into the embed stage. See? It creates this continuous loop of improvement tailored for that specific U.S. workplace. It's definitely not a one-off project, it's an ongoing thing.
Wow, seeing how those stages connect really shows how it could be a self-sustaining system for leadership in U.S. companies, much more powerful than isolated initiatives. Now, you mentioned some global benchmark, earlier companies that have done aspects of this well. What can U.S. companies learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking globally can offer really useful lessons for U.S. businesses. Take Microsoft under Satya Nadella. Their whole transformation, it wasn't just talk about having a growth mindset. They actively embedded it, made it like a core behavioral operating system for the whole company. That meant constant communication, leaders modeling it, a real cultural push on learning from mistakes. Key stuff for U.S. tech firms dealing with constant change.
So it wasn't just a slogan, it was baked into the daily work of a huge U.S. relevant tech player. Interesting. What about Unilever?
Unilever built something called the U-led ecosystem. What's really relevant there, especially for big, complex U.S. corporations, is how they tied leadership development directly into their main business operations. It wasn't some separate HR thing off to the side. And that really shifted how managers saw their jobs. They weren't just managing tasks, they were expected to be enablers, stewards of their team's leadership growth.
That's a pretty big mental shift for managers, one that could be valuable for a lot of U.S. companies. And you mentioned Hair Group in China, too.
Yes. Hair Group in China is maybe a more radical example. They basically broke down their traditional hierarchy, reorganized into thousands of small, self-managing teams, micro-enterprises, they call them. That's serious decentralization of leadership and decision-making. Authority got tied directly to creating value, not just your rank. Now, that might seem extreme for many U.S. firms today, but it definitely makes you question traditional hierarchies common in the U.S. It shows how empowering smaller, agile teams can really unlock leadership potential everywhere. The big takeaway from these examples, they're not just little programs. They represent fundamentally different operating models for leadership that U.S. companies can really learn from, adapt, and maybe implement pieces of.
Those examples really make leadership capital feel tangible, showing how it works in different kinds of organizations relevant to the US. So, okay, imagine a US company listening right now thinking, all right, this makes sense, but where do we even begin? How do we start building this in our own place? What are some practical first steps for, say, HR strategists in the US?
Okay, several things U.S. HR folks can do. First, do a real audit of your current leadership capital. Don't just look at your formal programs. Use things like pulse surveys, find out about trust levels, collaboration across U.S. teams. Maybe use network analysis to see who really has influence, informally. Look at behavioral data around decisions and getting things done. Get that baseline picture of leadership capacity in your U.S. context.
So start with a clear, data-backed view of what the leadership landscape actually looks like within their U.S. operations. Smart. What's next, practically?
Next, design learning so it's embedded in the moments that really matter in your U.S. workplace. Move away from relying only on those generic offsite workshops. Instead, build learning opportunities into key times like when a new team launches or during conflict resolution or when you're pivoting strategy. That makes the learning way more relevant, timely, and sticky for people working in a U.S. company.
Yeah, it makes learning feel less like homework and more like just part of doing the job better in the U.S. What else can U.S. companies do?
Another big one. Actively incentivize leadership behaviors in all roles within the U.S. organization, not just managers. Build things like coaching skills, collaboration, giving good feedback right into performance reviews, even for individual contributors. That really drives home the message that leadership is everyone's job across the U.S. workforce. Also, invest in making your managers leadership multipliers. Train them to coach, not just control. Help them see their role as developing leadership in their teams, which might be different from traditional U.S. management styles. Recognize and reward the managers who are great at fostering leadership in others.
So shifting managers from directors to developers of talent within that U.S. context, that's a potentially huge cultural shift. And one last piece of practical advice for U.S. companies wanting to build this.
Finally, maybe think about shifting your traditional L&D function towards becoming more like leadership labs. Create safe spaces within your U.S. company where people can try out new leadership behaviors, maybe prototype different ways to tackle problems, learn from things that don't work out perfectly. It encourages that culture of ongoing leadership development and lets you figure out what really works for your specific U.S. organization and scale it.
This has been incredibly insightful. It's really clear that leadership capital isn't just some buzzword. It feels like a necessary evolution for U.S. companies needing strength and resilience today. It's about getting that leadership isn't just for a few at the top, but something that needs to be woven into the whole organization, making it, like our sources said, everyone's business in the U.S.
Exactly. And, while it might sound a bit abstract at first, leadership capital is a very real, often overlooked asset inside U.S. companies. It's there, waiting to be developed and put to work.
So here's something for you, our listener, to think about regarding your own U.S. workplace or maybe companies you observe here. How would really shifting that focus away from just developing individual leaders and towards actively building this collective leadership capacity, how would that fundamentally change how work gets done, how challenges get tackled, how opportunities are grabbed in the U.S. business world? And maybe what's one small practical step your organization, or maybe even just you in your role, could take, starting now, to begin building that crucial infrastructure of leadership in the U.S. context? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you, viewers, for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with your colleagues. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel by clicking that subscribe button below so you never miss out on valuable insights. I'm Brian Edmonds, signing off. See you in the next one.